In the cold morning light of February 3rd, 1637, Peter Wynants stood in the crowded tavern of Nieuw Schutte in Amsterdam, his hands trembling as he held a single tulip bulb. It was an unremarkable thing, a small brown onion no larger than a fist, wrapped in protective cloth. But 3 weeks ago, this particular bulb, a rare Semper Augustus with flame-like red and white petals, had sold for 15,200 guilders. That was enough to buy one of the grandest canal houses in Amsterdam, complete with a garden and a coach house. Yesterday, Wynants had tried to sell it for 2,000 guilders and found no buyers. This morning, as the church bells rang across the city, he was offering it for 500 guilders to anyone who would take it. The men around him, wealthy merchants who only days ago had been his eager competitors, turned away in silence. They knew what he knew. The greatest financial bubble in human history had just burst, and everyone in the room was about to lose everything. To understand how the Dutch Republic, the most sophisticated financial power of the 17th century, could descend into collective madness over flower bulbs, we must first understand the astonishing engine of wealth that created the conditions for such excess. In March 1602, the States General of the Netherlands granted a charter to an entity that would change the course of world history. It was called the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, known to history as the VOC. This was not simply a trading company. It was a state within a state, a corporation with the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, and mint its own currency. The VOC was granted a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. It was, in effect, given ownership of half the world. But the most revolutionary aspect of the VOC was not its military might or its geographic reach. It was the way it was financed. The VOC was the first publicly traded company in history. Previous trading ventures had been financed through partnerships that dissolved after each voyage. Investors would pool their money for a single expedition, and when the ships returned, the cargo would be sold and the partnership would dissolve. If the ships sank, you lost everything. If they returned laden with spices, you made a fortune. But then you had to start over. The VOC changed this ancient model. It offered something unprecedented. It offered permanent shares. For the first time in human history, you could buy a piece of a company that would exist in perpetuity. You became a shareholder, not a partner. You owned a fraction of the ships, the warehouses, the forts, the future profits, everything. The shares were transferable, tradable, and divisible. This simple innovation created the modern stock market. Within weeks of the VOC's founding, thousands of Dutch citizens from every level of society rushed to invest. Merchants and widows, bakers and brewers poured money into the company. The initial capital raised was 6.5 million guilders, a staggering sum for the era, 10 times larger than its nearest competitor, the English East India Company. The VOC did not disappoint its investors. Its ships, armed with cannons and crewed by hardened sailors, sailed to the spice islands of Indonesia and seized control of the nutmeg, clove, and pepper trade. These spices, which were literally worth their weight in gold in European markets, flowed into Amsterdam's warehouses. The VOC built fortified trading posts in Batavia, Ceylon, Malacca, and Formosa. It fought brutal wars against the Portuguese and the Spanish, sinking their fleets and burning their settlements. It bribed local rulers, toppled kingdoms, and established plantations worked by enslaved laborers. The profits were breathtaking. In 1605, Just 3 years after its founding, the VOC paid out its first dividend, a 75% return on investment. The investors were ecstatic. The value of VOC shares began to rise. And with that rise came a new phenomenon in human history: speculation. In 1609, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange opened in a covered courtyard where traders gathered to buy and sell VOC shares. This was the first official stock exchange in the world, and it created a class of professional speculators who made their living trading paper. The wealth flooding into Amsterdam transformed the city into the financial capital of the world. Dutch merchants financed trade across the globe. They loaned money to kings and emperors. They built elegant canal houses decorated with marble and gold leaf. They commissioned paintings from Rembrandt and Vermeer. The Dutch middle class, enriched by VOC dividends and trade profits, developed a taste for luxury goods. Exotic imports from the East became status symbols. Chinese porcelain, Japanese lacquerware, Indian textiles, and Persian rugs filled their homes. But nothing captured the imagination of the Dutch quite like flowers. The tulip, a flower native to Central Asia, had been introduced to Europe in the mid-16th century. Dutch horticulturalists, already renowned for their skill in cultivating flowers, fell in love with the tulip's vibrant colors and elegant shape. They began breeding new varieties, crossbreeding different tulips to create unique patterns and hues. Some tulips developed a curious trait called breaking, where a virus caused the petals to display intricate streaks and flames of contrasting colors. These broken tulips were rare and spectacularly beautiful. A single flower could display crimson flames on a pure white background, or golden streaks on a deep purple base. By the 1620s, wealthy Dutch merchants were paying significant sums for rare tulip bulbs to display in their gardens. Owning a garden filled with exotic tulips became the ultimate status symbol, a way to demonstrate wealth and refined taste. But tulips had a unique characteristic that made them perfect for speculation. They could only be planted in the autumn, and they bloomed in the spring. The bulbs spent the summer dormant, and during this dormant period, they could be dug up and sold. This meant that for much of the year, you were not buying a flower, you were buying a promise. You were buying a piece of paper that represented a claim on a bulb that was sitting in someone's garden. The market for tulips began to expand beyond gardeners and hobbyists. Traders who knew nothing about flowers began to see an opportunity. If the price of rare tulips kept rising, you did not need to plant them. You could buy a bulb in November, sell it in January, and make a profit without ever seeing the actual flower. By 1634, the tulip market had evolved into something far more complex than simple buying and selling. Traders developed a system called wind handle, or wind trade, which was essentially a futures market. You could buy a contract for a tulip bulb that was still in the ground, agreeing to take delivery months later at a fixed price. If the market price rose above your contract price, you could sell the contract to someone else and pocket the difference without ever touching the actual bulb. This created a peculiar situation where the same bulb could be sold dozens of times on paper before it ever left the soil. The contracts became more valuable than the flowers themselves. People were trading claims on claims, abstractions built on abstractions. It was a market built on confidence and momentum, divorced entirely from the underlying value of a flower bulb. And as long as prices kept rising, the system worked beautifully. In the winter of 1636, the tulip market exploded. Prices that had been rising steadily for years suddenly went vertical. A Semper Augustus bulb that had sold for 1,000 guilders in 1633 was now selling for 5,500 guilders. A Viceroy bulb jumped from 3 guilders to 2,500 guilders in a matter of weeks. Ordinary people, watching their neighbors grow wealthy from tulip trading, began to liquidate their savings to enter the market. Weavers sold their looms. Farmers mortgaged their land. Servants spent their life savings on a single bulb, convinced they could sell it days later for double the price. The taverns of Dutch cities became impromptu trading floors where men gathered to buy and sell tulip contracts over beer and tobacco. Auctioneers traveled from town to town, holding tulip sales that attracted hundreds of bidders. The mania cut across all social classes. Aristocrats and day laborers sat side by side, bidding against each other for flowers they would never plant. The most absurd aspect of the mania was that many of the traders had never seen the tulips they were buying. Since most of the trading happened in winter, when the bulbs were dormant and buried, people were buying based on descriptions and paintings. A trader might pay 1,000 guilders for a bulb called Admiral van der Eyck, based solely on a hand-drawn illustration showing its color pattern. There was no quality control, no guarantee that the bulb would even sprout. Some bulbs were diseased, others were mislabeled. But it did not matter, because most buyers had no intention of planting them. They were buying to sell. The entire market had become a pure confidence game, a collective hallucination sustained by the belief that someone else would always pay more. Economic historians would later recognize this as the defining characteristic of every financial bubble. The greater fool theory. You might be a fool to pay such a high price, but there will always be a greater fool willing to pay even more. The professional merchants who had built their fortunes on the VOC and legitimate trade watched the tulip mania with growing alarm. They understood that the tulip market was not based on real value. Unlike VOC shares, which represented ownership of ships and warehouses and trade routes, tulip bulbs produced nothing except more tulip bulbs. They could not generate revenue. They could not pay dividends. They were ornamental plants with no industrial or commercial use. A handful of voices called for restraint. Pamphlets circulated, warning that the market was unsustainable, that prices had lost all connection to reality. But these warnings were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Every week brought new stories of people who had turned tiny investments into fortunes. A sailor who had sold a single rare bulb and bought a house. A maid who had traded her way from one common bulb to a collection worth thousands. These stories fueled the frenzy. If everyone around you was getting rich, could you afford to stand aside? If you are still watching this moment when an entire nation convinced itself that flowers were more valuable than houses, if you see the echoes of every bubble that followed, from the South Sea to the .com to the crypto crash, go ahead and like this video and comment the word tulips below. Let's see how many of us recognize that human nature never changes, only the names of the assets we gamble on. By late January 1637, the tulip market reached heights that defy rational explanation. A single Semper Augustus bulb sold for 6,000 guilders, plus a new carriage and 2 horses. That amount of money could buy 8 fat pigs, 4 oxen, 12 sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed with linens, a suit of clothes, and a silver cup. All of that for a single flower bulb. But the people buying at these prices were not insane. They were acting on a reasonable assumption that had held true for 3 years. Prices always went up. Tomorrow's buyer would pay more than today's buyer. The momentum seemed unstoppable. In the taverns where the trading happened, the atmosphere was electric. Men shouted bids across crowded rooms. Contracts were scrawled on scraps of paper and witnessed by drunken strangers. Money changed hands in frantic bursts. Fortunes were made before lunch and doubled before dinner. Then, on the first Tuesday of February 1637, in a tavern in Haarlem, something broke. An auctioneer stood before a crowd holding contracts for a collection of valuable tulip bulbs. He opened the bidding with the standard prices from the previous week. No one bid. He lowered the price. Still silence. He lowered it again, offering bulbs at half their previous value. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room, but no hands went up. The auctioneer, sensing panic, tried to rally the crowd with assurances that this was just a momentary hesitation, that the market would recover by tomorrow. But the men in that tavern understood something that the auctioneer did not want to admit. The greater fool had not shown up. For the first time in 3 years, there was no one willing to pay more than yesterday's price. The chain was broken. Word of the failed auction spread through Haarlem within hours and reached Amsterdam by the next morning. And with that news came a wave of cold, nauseating realization. If no one was buying, then the contracts everyone held were worthless. The collapse was not gradual. It was instantaneous and total. Within a week, tulip prices fell by 95%. Bulbs that had sold for thousands of guilders could not find buyers at any price. The contracts that people had bought on credit, expecting to flip them for profit, became instruments of ruin. Sellers demanded payment for bulbs that buyers now refused to accept. Debtors who had borrowed money to enter the market suddenly owed sums they could never repay. Legal disputes erupted across the Dutch Republic. The courts were flooded with cases. Buyers argued that the contracts were not enforceable because the trades had been speculative wagers, not legitimate commercial transactions. Sellers demanded that the contracts be honored, that debts be paid in full. The Dutch government, recognizing that enforcing every tulip contract would bankrupt half the population, stepped in with a compromise. They declared that all tulip contracts signed after November 1636 could be voided with a penalty of just 10% of the contract price. This decision saved many people from total ruin, but it also meant that the sellers, the people who had actually owned the bulbs, were left holding flowers that no one wanted. Peter Winants, the merchant standing in the tavern that cold February morning, was one of thousands caught in the collapse. He had entered the tulip market cautiously at first, buying a few common bulbs and selling them for modest profits. But as the mania intensified, he had grown bolder. He had taken out loans against his warehouse inventory to buy contracts for rare bulbs. He had signed agreements to purchase bulbs that would not be delivered until spring, confident that he could sell the contracts at a profit long before delivery. Now those contracts were worthless, and the creditors were knocking at his door. His wife begged him to declare bankruptcy, to walk away and start over. But Winants, a proud man who had built his trading business over 20 years, could not bear the shame. He sold his warehouse, his inventory, and his house to settle his debts. By the end of 1637, he was living in a rented room above a bakery, working as a clerk for a shipping company. He had been destroyed by flowers. The tulip mania did not destroy the Dutch economy. The Republic was too wealthy, too diversified, too resilient. The VOC continued to pay dividends. The stock exchange continued to function. The merchants who had stayed out of the tulip market or who had sold early emerged unscathed. But the psychological damage was profound. The mania had revealed something uncomfortable about human nature and about markets. It had shown that rational, educated, successful people could be swept up in collective delusion, that prices could detach completely from value, that the wisdom of crowds could turn into the madness of mobs. In the AE aftermath, the Dutch developed a deep skepticism of speculative excess. Pamphlets and plays mocked the tulip traders as fools and gamblers. The term windhandle became a slur, a synonym for empty speculation. But the lessons were not universally learned. Within a generation, new bubbles would emerge. The VOC itself, the great engine of Dutch wealth, continued to dominate global trade for another century. At its peak, the VOC was the richest corporation in history, with a fleet of over 4,000 ships and a private army of 70,000 soldiers. It paid consistent dividends to its shareholders and returned profits that dwarfed any other commercial enterprise. But even the VOC could not escape the dangers of speculation and mismanagement. By the mid-18th century, corruption and inefficiency had hollowed out the company from within. The directors in Amsterdam were more interested in their own enrichment than in the long-term health of the enterprise. They paid dividends even when the company was losing money, borrowing to maintain the illusion of profitability. They hid debts and inflated asset values. The VOC share price remained high because investors trusted the company's reputation, not because the underlying business was sound. When the truth finally emerged in the 1780s, the VOC was revealed to be insolvent. It collapsed in 1799, nationalized by the Dutch government, and dissolved. The world's first publicly traded company ended as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power and financial manipulation. The parallels between the tulip mania and modern financial bubbles are impossible to ignore. The South Sea bubble of 1720, the railway mania of the 1840s, the stock market crash of 1929, the dot-com bubble of 2000, the housing crash of 2008, the cryptocurrency frenzy of 2021. Each of these episodes followed the same pattern. A new asset or technology captures public imagination. Early investors make spectacular profits. The media amplifies success, stories. Ordinary people, fearing they will miss out, rush to invest. Prices rise beyond any rational valuation. Critics are dismissed as old-fashioned or pessimistic. Then, suddenly, confidence evaporates. Prices collapse. Wealth vanishes. The aftermath brings recrimination, regulation, and solemn promises that it will never happen again. Until it does. What makes the tulip mania so remarkable is not that it happened, but that it happened so early in the history of financial markets. The Dutch had only invented the stock market a few decades before they invented the stock market bubble. They had barely learned to trade shares before they learned to gamble on flowers. This suggests that speculation is not a bug in the financial system. It is a feature of human psychology. We are pattern-seeking creatures wired to follow the crowd, to believe in momentum, to assume that the future will resemble the recent past. When we see prices rising, our brains tell us they will keep rising. When everyone around us is profiting, we feel compelled to join in. These instincts served our ancestors well when choosing which berries to eat or which hunting grounds to visit. But in financial markets, these same instincts lead us to ruin. The Dutch Republic's experience with the VOC and the tulip mania established the template for modern capitalism, for better and worse. The VOC showed that corporations could pool capital from thousands of investors, operate across continents and generate wealth on an unprecedented scale. It proved that stock markets could efficiently allocate resources and spread risk. But the tulip mania showed that markets could also become unhinged from reality, that speculation could become indistinguishable from gambling, that collective euphoria could override individual judgment. Both lessons remain relevant today. Every modern investor navigates the tension between these two truths. Markets are powerful engines of prosperity, but they are also arenas of delusion and loss. In the quiet archives of Amsterdam, you can still find records of the tulip mania, ledgers listing the sale prices of long-extinct flower varieties, court documents detailing disputes over bulbs that rotted in the ground centuries ago, pamphlets mocking the foolishness of men who traded houses for flowers. These documents are historical curiosities now, but they speak to something timeless. They remind us that financial manias are not modern phenomena caused by computers or complex derivatives or social media hype. They are ancient patterns of human behavior, repeated across centuries with different props. The only thing that changes is the object of speculation. In 1637, it was tulips. In 2021, it was digital images of cartoon apes. The psychology is identical. The Dutch learned to live with their tulip shame. They built it into their cultural memory as a warning and a joke. But they did not stop speculating. They could not. Because speculation is inseparable from commerce, from investment, from progress. Every venture into the unknown requires a bet on an uncertain future. Every innovation begins as a speculation on what might be possible. The trick is not to eliminate speculation, but to recognize it for what it is, to distinguish between investment and gambling, to know when confidence has crossed into delusion. The Dutch of the 1630s forgot that distinction, and they paid the price. But their mistake gave the world its first clear example of a market bubble. It provided a case study that economists and investors have been analyzing for 4 centuries. The tulip mania became the original cautionary tale, the first chapter in the ongoing story of human beings trying to outsmart each other in the pursuit of wealth. Today, when we watch a new cryptocurrency soar to absurd valuations before crashing to nothing, when we see stocks in money-losing companies trade at prices that defy logic, when we hear about ordinary people taking out loans to invest in the latest craze, we should think about Peter Wynants standing in that Amsterdam tavern in February 1637. We should remember that he was not stupid or uniquely greedy. He was simply human, doing what humans have always done when caught in the gravitational pull of a rising market. He believed the music would keep playing. He thought he would know when to exit before the crash. He was wrong. And 400 years later, people are still making the same mistake. The names change. The technology evolves. But the pattern repeats because we are still running the same basic software in our brains. We still chase momentum. We still fear missing out. We still believe, against all historical evidence, that this time is different. The great irony of the tulip mania is that tulips are still with us. They are beautiful, commercially successful flowers grown by the millions in the Netherlands every year. The modern Dutch tulip industry is a sensible, profitable business that exports bulbs around the world. You can buy a tulip bulb today for a few euros. It will bloom in your garden and bring you genuine pleasure. The flower itself was never the problem. The problem was the belief that a flower could make you rich without effort, that prices could rise forever, that wealth could be conjured from collective belief. That delusion died in February 1637, but it was reborn in different forms again and again. It will be reborn again tomorrow in some new guise, attracting a new generation of speculators who believe they have discovered the secret to easy wealth. And the cycle will continue because we never truly learn. We only forget and repeat. Tokens used, 8266, remaining 19,117.34.